Night fell quickly on the farm, a blanket of darkness enveloping the fields and the old barn. I had always been fond of the night, the cool air and the peaceful quiet that accompanied it. But tonight was different. There was an eerie silence that seemed to suffocate everything, making each creak of the old wooden house feel like a shout in the dark. I sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit fields, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound, its steady beat a reminder of the passage of time. The farm had been in my family for generations, a sprawling piece of land that stretched as far as the eye could see. But tonight, it felt like a prison. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and making the old house groan. I shivered and stood up, deciding to check the barn one last time before bed. I grabbed my flashlight and coat, the beam cutting through the darkness as I stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. The barn loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. I trudged across the field, my boots crunching on the dry grass. The flashlight's beam wavered as the wind grew stronger, and I quickened my pace, eager to finish the check and return to the warmth of the house. As I approached the barn, I heard a faint sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. I paused, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. Shaking my head, I pushed open the barn door, the hinges squealing in protest. The smell of hay and old wood filled my nostrils as I stepped inside, the flashlight revealing rows of empty stalls. I made my way down the aisle, checking each stall, ensuring the doors were secure. The barn was old, but it was sturdy, a testament to my family's hard work over the years. I reached the end of the aisle and turned to leave when I heard it again, a whisper, clearer this time, coming from the far corner of the barn. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight around, the beam dancing over the walls and ceiling. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty barn. There was no response. I took a step forward, the whispering growing louder, more distinct. It sounded like a voice, low and urgent, speaking words I couldn't understand. I moved closer, the beam of the flashlight illuminating a pile of old hay bales. The whispering was coming from behind them. I hesitated, fear creeping up my spine. Swallowing hard, I reached out and began to move the hay bales aside, the dust rising in the air, making me cough. As I uncovered the last bale, I saw a small, hidden door, almost invisible against the wooden wall. The whispering was louder now, a constant stream of unintelligible words. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle, my mind screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity, or perhaps something more sinister, compelled me to open the door. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The whispering seemed to emanate from the depths below, calling me down. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair, the wood creaking under my weight. The air was colder here, and a shiver ran through me as I descended. The flashlight flickered, and I tapped it, willing it to stay on. The stairs seemed to go on forever, but finally, I reached the bottom, the whispering now a cacophony of voices. I found myself in a small, dirt-floored room, the walls lined with old wooden shelves. The air was damp, and the smell of earth and decay filled my lungs. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest, covered in dust and cobwebs. The whispering seemed to be coming from inside it, the voices overlapping, a symphony of fear. I approached the chest, my heart racing, and knelt beside it. The wood was cold to the touch, and my hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside, I found a collection of old, yellowed papers, covered in strange symbols and drawings. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, as I picked up one of the papers, trying to make sense of the markings. The symbols seemed to writhe and twist on the page, alive with some dark energy. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the flashlight and plunging me into darkness. Panic seized me, and I dropped the paper, scrambling to turn the flashlight back on. When the beam finally cut through the darkness again, I saw them shadowy figures, standing around the room, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The whispering grew to a crescendo, the voices now chanting a dark, guttural language that filled me with dread. The figures moved closer, their forms shifting and contorting, the air growing colder with each step. I backed away, my heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, one of the figures reached out, its hand passing through the air like smoke, and touched my chest. A searing pain shot through me, and I screamed, the sound echoing in the small room. The other figures joined in, their hands cold and insubstantial, their touch like fire. The chanting grew louder, the room spinning around me, the pain unbearable. Just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the figures stopped, the whispering ceased, and the room fell silent. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my body trembling. When I finally looked up, the figures were gone, the room empty except for the chest and its contents. The air was still cold, but the oppressive weight had lifted. I stood up, my legs weak, and made my way back up the stairs, the flashlight's beam steady once more. I stumbled out of the barn and back to the house, locking the door behind me. The whispering had stopped, but the fear remained, a dark shadow on my soul. I knew the farm would never be the same, and neither would I. The darkness that lurked beneath the surface had been awakened, and I could only hope it would stay buried. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. I grew up on my family's farm, a sprawling piece of land nestled in the heart of nowhere. The isolation was comforting in a way, the quiet only broken by the sounds of animals and the wind rustling through the fields. It was a place where the outside world seemed far away, and the worries of modern life didn't intrude. But the farm held its own secrets, and one summer, I discovered a darkness that would forever change how I saw my childhood home. It started on a hot, sticky evening in July. I was 15, and my parents had gone into town for supplies, leaving me alone to tend to the evening chores. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields as I finished feeding the animals. As I was closing up the barn, I noticed something strange in the distance, a flicker of light coming from the old, abandoned well at the edge of our property. The well had been out of use for years, ever since my great-grandfather had died. It was covered with a heavy wooden lid, and no one ever went near it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from the barn and made my way toward the well, the tall grass brushing against my legs. As I approached, the flickering light disappeared, leaving the area shrouded in darkness. I shone the flashlight around, but saw nothing unusual. Just the same old well, covered in vines and surrounded by weeds. I was about to turn back when I heard a faint, whispering voice, seemingly coming from deep within the well. "Help me," the voice said, so soft I almost thought I had imagined it. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice called out again, louder this time, more desperate. "Help me, please." Against my better judgment, I moved closer, peering into the darkness of the well. The wooden lid was slightly ajar, and I could see the black void beneath. The voice continued to plead, a chorus of whispers echoing up from the depths. I hesitated, then grabbed the edge of the lid and heaved it aside. The smell of damp earth and decay wafted up, making me gag. I shone the flashlight into the well, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I had to do something. There was an old rope nearby, and I tied it securely to a post before lowering myself into the well. The walls were slick with moss, and I had to be careful not to lose my grip. As I descended, the air grew colder, and the whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, all begging for help. Finally, I reached the bottom. The flashlight illuminated a small, muddy chamber, and my breath caught in my throat. There, half buried in the mud, was a skeleton, its bony fingers clutching a tattered diary. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I picked up the diary, my hand shaking. The cover was worn and stained, but I could still make out the initials JT, my great-grandfather's initials. I opened it, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting was shaky, the words almost illegible, but I could make out enough to understand. My great-grandfather had written about the farm, about strange occurrences and sightings of ghostly figures. He had become obsessed with the well, convinced that it was a gateway to another world. He had heard the whispers, just like I had, and had been driven mad by them. The diary ended abruptly, the final entry smeared with what looked like blood. As I stood there, the air grew colder still, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, the flashlight's beam illuminating a figure a shadowy, indistinct form, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The whispers began again, louder and more frenzied, filling my head with their desperate pleas. I scrambled to climb back up the rope, my heart racing. The figure reached out, its touch like ice, and I screamed, kicking at it desperately. The voices grew louder, a chorus of agony and despair, and I felt my grip on reality slipping. Somehow, I managed to haul myself out of the well, collapsing on the ground in a heap. The whispers faded, and the presence receded, leaving me trembling and gasping for breath. I covered the well as best I could and ran back to the house, the diary clutched tightly in my hand. When my parents returned, I tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I had imagined it, or that it was a result of being alone for too long, but I knew the truth. The well was a gateway to something dark and terrible, and my great-grandfather had fallen victim to it. I buried the diary in the fields, hoping to put the past to rest, but the memory of that night haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers were still out there, waiting. I moved away as soon as I could, leaving the farm and its secrets behind. Years later, I still have nightmares about the well, about the voices and the shadowy figure. I've tried to forget, to move on, but the darkness I encountered that summer will always be a part of me. The farm is still there, abandoned now, a forgotten relic of a simpler time. But the well remains, a silent sentinel to the horrors it holds, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover its secrets. Living on a farm in the heartland, miles away from the nearest neighbor, meant that solitude was part of my daily life. The farm had been in my family for generations, and it was a place I knew intimately, every acre and every corner. Yet, as the sun set and the shadows grew long, the vastness of the land could take on an unsettling character. It was on one such evening that my ordinary life became intertwined with a nightmare I could never have imagined. It started with the cornfield, an ocean of green stalks that stretched out behind the barn. The corn was tall, nearly ready for harvest, and in the twilight, it took on a dark, almost ominous hue. I was finishing up the last of my chores, the cool of the evening a welcome respite from the day's heat, when I noticed something strange. A rustling in the corn, more pronounced than the usual sway of the stalks in the breeze. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow, and listened. The sound came again, louder this time, and distinctly unnatural. It was as if someone or something was moving through the field. Grabbing my flashlight, I made my way towards the source of the noise. As I approached the edge of the field, the light began to flicker, casting erratic beams that did little to pierce the growing darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain. There was no response, just the rustling of the corn. My heart began to pound, a sense of unease settling over me. I stepped into the field, the flashlight trembling in my hand, the corn towering over me like silent sentinels. As I ventured deeper, the rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dry earth. I swept the flashlight back and forth, the light casting long, wavering shadows. And then, I saw a figure standing among the corn, cloaked in darkness, holding a scythe. The sight of the figure stopped me cold. It was tall, impossibly tall, its face hidden beneath a hood. The scythe glinted in the flashlight's beam, its blade razor sharp. The figure stood motionless, as if waiting for something. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It was as if it were a part of the field itself, an embodiment of the darkness that had fallen over the farm. My instincts screamed at me to run, but curiosity, or perhaps a sense of duty to my family's land, drove me forward. I took a tentative step closer, and the figure raised the scythe, the blade slicing through the air with a hiss. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Suddenly, the figure moved, gliding towards me with an unnatural grace. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, the cornfield a blur around me. I could hear the swish of the scythe behind me, cutting through the stalks, gaining on me. I burst out of the cornfield and sprinted towards the house, not daring to look back. I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving, my mind racing. I locked the door and turned off the flashlight, peering out the window into the darkened field. There was no sign of the figure. Had I imagined it? The thought provided little comfort. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind sent my heart racing. I kept seeing the figure in my mind, its silent, menacing presence a constant reminder of what I had seen. When morning finally came, I felt no relief, only a growing sense of dread. The next few days passed in a blur of unease. I avoided the cornfield, focusing on other chores around the farm. But the figure haunted me, a shadow in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting. On the third night, the dreams began. I would find myself back in the cornfield, the figure always there, always holding the scythe. In my dreams, I could never escape, the cornfield stretching out endlessly, the figure always one step behind me. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the fear as real as it had been that first night. Desperate for answers, I went to the local library, searching through old records and newspapers, hoping to find something that could explain what I had seen. I found an old article about a tragedy that had occurred on a neighboring farm decades ago. A man, driven mad by loss and grief, had taken to wandering the fields at night, a scythe in hand. He had vanished one night, his body never found. Some said his spirit still haunted the fields, a restless soul searching for peace. The story sent chills down my spine. Was it his spirit I had seen? The idea seemed absurd, yet I couldn't dismiss it. That night, I resolved to confront the figure, to find out the truth. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination born of desperation, I ventured back into the cornfield. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick with anticipation. I moved slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rustling started again, the same unnatural sound that had drawn me in before. I pressed on, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it, the cloaked figure, standing just as before, the scythe held aloft. It was closer this time, almost within arm's reach. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure remained silent, but then, slowly, it lowered the scythe, pointing it towards the ground. I followed its gesture with the flashlight, and there, in the dirt, I saw something glinting. It was a small, rusted key. I reached down to pick it up, my fingers brushing the cold metal. As I did, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the darkness until it was gone. I was alone in the field, the key in my hand. Back at the house, I examined the key under the light. It was old, worn with age, and I couldn't imagine what it might unlock. Then I remembered the old root cellar beneath the barn, a place my family had long since abandoned. The lock on the cellar door had been broken for years, but perhaps the key had once belonged to it. The next morning, I made my way to the barn, the key clutched tightly in my hand. I found the cellar door, its heavy wooden frame nearly swallowed by overgrowth. Taking a deep breath, I inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a creak, the door swung open, revealing a set of stone steps descending into darkness. The air was cold and damp as I descended, the light from my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the steps, I found a small, musty room filled with old crates and forgotten tools. In the corner, half hidden by debris, was a trunk. It was locked, but the key fit here as well. I opened the trunk, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, I found a collection of old journals and photographs, the relics of a bygone era. As I sifted through them, a story began to emerge. The journals belonged to the man from the neighboring farm, the one who had vanished. He wrote of his descent into madness, his nights spent wandering the fields, consumed by grief over the loss of his family. The last journal entry spoke of a key, hidden in the cornfield, that would unlock the root cellar where he had hidden his most precious memories. He believed that by keeping them safe, he could somehow find peace. But his mind had betrayed him, and he had vanished before he could retrieve them. As I read, a sense of sadness washed over me. The figure I had seen wasn't a vengeful spirit, but a soul trapped by its own sorrow, searching for a way to move on. By finding the key and uncovering his story, I had somehow helped him find peace. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The dreams were gone, and the oppressive sense of dread had lifted. The farm seemed brighter, the shadows less menacing. The cornfield, once a place of fear, was now a reminder of a life touched by tragedy and finally laid to rest. The figure with the scythe had vanished, but its memory remained, a haunting presence that had brought me to a deeper understanding of the land I called home. The farm was still vast and lonely, but it was no longer a place of fear. Instead, it was a place where stories, even the darkest ones, could find their resolution, and where the past could finally be put to rest.